A billionaire sacked his housekeeper on the spot, simply for blowing a bubble near his son, but no one expected what would happen next, because that same child, who hadn't spoken a word in over a year, whispered something that silenced the entire estate. This is not just a story about discipline or routine, it's about quiet moments that change everything. A story of hope, of healing, and of unexpected love. So grab a cuppa, make yourself comfortable, and prepare for a tale that will stay with you long after the final word. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in Australia, or the world, you're watching from. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sandstone path of the Carver estate, a sprawling property nestled in the heart of Hunter Valley. The vineyards stretched toward the horizon, their neat rows punctuated by eucalyptus trees that swayed gently in the autumn breeze. Ilara Mitchell knelt on the path, her calloused hands working methodically with a scrub brush, removing the fine red dust that had settled overnight. At 35, Ilara was a woman of few words. Her deep brown eyes held stories she rarely shared, and her movements were quiet, efficient, the product of years spent making herself invisible in the homes of the wealthy. The Carver estate was her latest posting, and by far the most demanding, not because of the work itself, but because of the silence that permeated every corner of the mansion. Mitchell. The voice was crisp, businesslike. Ilara looked up, squinting against the sun. Looming over her was the tall figure of Elliot Carver, master of the estate and one of Australia's most prominent solar energy entrepreneurs. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who commanded rooms before he even entered them. His once warm features had hardened over the past year, grief etching permanent lines around his eyes. "The West Wing windows need attention," he said, not waiting for a response before turning on his heel. He paused almost as an afterthought. "And please keep the noise to a minimum. Arlo had a difficult night." Ilara nodded, though he wasn't looking. "Yes, Mr. Carver." She watched him stride back toward the main house, his shoulders rigid beneath his tailored shirt. Elliot Carver ran his business empire from the East Wing, his voice occasionally carrying across the courtyard as he dictated terms into conference calls. The Hunter Valley property served as both his home and headquarters, a fortress of productivity and order since his wife's passing 18 months ago. Gathering her cleaning supplies, Ilara glanced toward the garden. There, beneath a massive gum tree, sat a small figure. Arlo Carver, 5 years old and impossibly still, was perched on a bench with a sketchbook open on his lap. He hadn't turned a page in the 20 minutes Ilara had been working. He simply sat, staring at nothing. Arlo hadn't spoken a word in over a year, not since the accident that took his mother. Ilara had been working at the Carver estate for 8 months, and in that time she'd never heard the boy's voice. The staff spoke about him in hushed tones, about the parade of specialists who came and went, about the night terrors that sometimes echoed through the halls, about how he'd simply closed off from the world, retreating into himself like a turtle into its shell. With a sigh, Ilara picked up her bucket and made her way toward the West Wing. As she passed near the garden, she found herself slowing. Something about the boy's isolation pulled at her, a familiar loneliness she recognized all too well. On impulse, she set down her supplies and reached into her pocket. Her fingers closed around a small plastic bottle, a silly trinket she kept with her, a remnant of her childhood in Alice Springs. Unscrewing the cap, she dipped the plastic wand into the soapy solution. Ilara didn't look directly at Arlo as she lifted the wand to her lips and gently blew. A perfect sphere emerged, catching the sunlight as it floated on the breeze. Then another, and another. 3 iridescent bubbles drifted across the garden, their rainbow surfaces shimmering. She hadn't meant to disturb him. It was just a moment of whimsy, a brief break from the rigid atmosphere of the estate. But as the third bubble danced past the gum tree, Ilara caught a flicker of movement from the corner of her eye. Arlo's head had lifted. His gaze followed the bubbles, tracking their lazy path through the air. And then, so subtle she almost missed it, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. A smile, tiny and tentative, but unmistakable. Ilara quickly put away the bubble solution and continued toward the West Wing, her heart racing. She told herself not to read too much into it. After all, what did she know about children like Arlo? She was just the housekeeper, not one of the expensive therapists or specialists Mr. Carver hired. Yet for the rest of the day, the image of that small smile stayed with her, warming something inside her chest that had been cold for a very long time. The following morning, Ilara arrived at the estate at her usual time, just after dawn, when the mist still clung to the vineyards. As she made her way toward the staff entrance, she noticed a small figure already seated beneath the gum tree. Arlo. He wasn't looking in her direction, but there was something about his posture that suggested expectation, as if he were waiting for her. Ilara hesitated, glancing toward the main house. Mr. Carver's rules were clear. Staff were not to interact with Arlo unless explicitly instructed to do so. The boy's routine was carefully monitored, his interactions strictly controlled, but there was no one watching in these early hours. Taking a deep breath, Ilara changed course and walked slowly toward the garden. She stopped several meters from Arlo, careful not to intrude on his space. Then, without a word, she took out the bubble solution. This time she watched him directly as she blew 3 perfect bubbles into the still morning air. Arlo's eyes widened as he tracked their flight. He didn't smile this time, but his entire body seemed to lean forward, following the movement with focused intensity. When the last bubble popped against a leaf, he turned to look at Ilara. Then, slowly, deliberately, he held up 3 fingers. Ilara's breath caught. She nodded, understanding instantly. 3 bubbles. He was counting. With careful movements, she blew 3 more bubbles. Arlo's fingers remained raised until the last bubble disappeared. Then he lowered his hand back to his lap. No words had been exchanged, but something significant had passed between them, a moment of connection that needed no language. "What are you doing?" The sharp voice made Ilara start. She turned to find Judith Brennan, the estate manager, standing behind her with arms crossed and lips pursed in disapproval. "Mr. Carver was very clear about staff interactions with Arlo," Judith said, her voice low but severe. "You're to finish your assigned tasks, not disrupt his routine." "I wasn't," Ilara began, but stopped herself. "Explaining would only make things worse. It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't," Judith replied, giving Ilara a pointed look before turning to Arlo. Her voice immediately softened. "Come along, Arlo. Ms. Patel will be here soon for your session." Arlo didn't move, his gaze still fixed on where the last bubble had vanished. "Arlo," Judith repeated, firmer this time. The boy rose reluctantly, his small shoulders slumping as he followed Judith toward the house. At the garden gate, he paused and looked back at Ilara, his expression unreadable. Ilara forced herself to turn away, focusing on the day's tasks ahead. She had no business forming attachments here, not to this place, and certainly not to a child who wasn't hers. She'd learned long ago that caring too deeply only led to heartache. Yet, as she scrubbed windows in the West Wing, she couldn't help but wonder about the boy beneath the gum tree and what other responses might be hiding behind his silence. For 3 days, Ilara avoided the garden during her morning rounds. She arrived later, took different paths to her assigned areas, and kept her head down whenever she glimpsed Arlo's small figure beneath the gum tree. It was better this way, she told herself. The boy had professionals to help him, people with credentials and training, not a housekeeper with a bottle of bubble solution. But on the 4th morning, as rain drummed steadily against the windows of her small cottage in Cessnock, Ilara found herself reaching for the bubble solution before leaving for work. She tucked it into her pocket without examining her motives too closely. The rain had cleared by the time she arrived at the estate, leaving the air fresh and the gardens glistening. Ilara was unlocking the supply closet when a soft sound made her turn. Arlo stood a few meters away, watching her with those solemn eyes that seemed to hold questions his voice couldn't ask. In his small hand, he clutched a piece of paper. Ilara glanced around nervously. It was early. The rest of the staff wouldn't arrive for another 30 minutes. Even Mr. Carver was unlikely to be up at this hour. "Good morning, Arlo," she said softly. The boy didn't respond, but he took a step closer and extended the paper toward her. Ilara hesitated before accepting it, careful not to make contact with his fingers. It was a drawing, childish but deliberate. 3 circles floated. Across the page, rendered in blue crayon, bubbles. Ilara's throat tightened. She looked from the drawing to Arlo's expectant face and knew she couldn't turn him away again. "Would you like to see some real ones?" she asked. Arlo didn't nod, but he didn't leave either. Ilara interpreted this as permission. She led the way to a covered portion of the veranda where they'd be sheltered if the rain returned, but still visible enough that she couldn't be accused of taking Arlo somewhere inappropriate. Kneeling to his level, she took out the bubble solution. Arlo watched her every movement with intense focus. 3? She asked, showing him the bottle. Arlo held up 3 fingers just as he had days before. Ilara dipped the wand and blew gently. 3 perfect bubbles drifted into the morning, their surfaces reflecting tiny rainbows as they caught the early light. Arlo's eyes followed them, his expression rapt. When they disappeared, he held up 4 fingers. 4 it is, Ilara said, and blew 4 more bubbles. They continued this silent exchange, Arlo indicating numbers with his fingers, Ilara responding with the exact count of bubbles. No words needed to pass between them. It was a language of its own, built on trust and simple joy. After 10 minutes, Ilara reluctantly put the bubble solution away. I have to start my work now, she explained, though she wasn't sure how much he understood. But maybe tomorrow. She left the offer hanging. Arlo watched her stand, his expression unchanged, but there was something in his eyes, a spark that hadn't been there before. As Ilara walked away, she heard a soft shuffle of feet. Glancing back, she saw Arlo following her at a distance, not demanding attention, not trying to stop her, just following, as if unwilling to break the tenuous connection they'd formed. Arlo should be at breakfast. The voice made both Ilara and Arlo freeze. Elliot Carver stood in the doorway of his study, a coffee mug in one hand and a tablet in the other. His expression was unreadable as his gaze moved from his son to Ilara. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carver," Ilara said quickly. "I was just heading to start on the East Wing." Elliot's eyes narrowed slightly. "And my son?" Before Ilara could answer, Maria, Arlo's nanny, hurried down the hallway. "There you are," she exclaimed, looking relieved. "I've been looking everywhere." She gave Ilara an accusatory glance before taking Arlo's hand. "Come along, your breakfast is getting cold." Arlo went without resistance, but as Maria led him away, he looked back over his shoulder, not at his father, but at Ilara. "Mitchell," Elliot said once they were alone. A word. Ilara followed him into his study, her stomach knotting. The room was immaculate, all clean lines and modern furniture, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the vineyard. On one wall hung a large portrait of a woman with Arlo's eyes and a smile that reached them, Diana Carver, whose absence haunted the estate like a ghost. "I wasn't aware you had experience with children," Elliot said, setting down his mug on a pristine desk. "I don't specifically," Ilara admitted. "I mean, I helped raise my younger siblings, but I'm not trained in—" "Then explain what I just witnessed," he interrupted. "My son, who hasn't voluntarily approached anyone in over a year, following you through the house." Ilara swallowed. I showed him some bubbles. In the garden. It seemed to interest him." "Bubbles," Elliot repeated flatly. "Yes, sir, just ordinary soap bubbles." She hesitated, then added, "He counts them." With his fingers. Something flickered across Elliot's face. Surprise, perhaps, or disbelief. He turned to look out the window, his shoulders tense beneath his expensive shirt. "Arlo has the best specialists in the country working with him," he said finally. "Behavioral therapists, speech pathologists, child psychologists. Not one of them has managed to engage him the way you apparently have." With bubbles. Ilara didn't know how to respond to that. She stood awkwardly, waiting to be reprimanded or dismissed. Instead, Elliot turned back to face her, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me about yourself, Mitchell. Your full background. Where did you work before coming here?" The question took her by surprise. "I grew up in Alice Springs, moved to Sydney after university, then Newcastle. I've been in domestic service for about 12 years now. Before the Carver estate, I worked for the Hendersons in Pocklebin." "And your qualifications?" "I have a degree in literature," she said, feeling increasingly uncomfortable under his scrutiny. "But my experience is in household management." Elliot nodded slowly, as if filing away this information. "Very well. You may go." Ilara turned to leave, relieved to escape the intensity of his gaze. "Mitchell," he called as she reached the door, "I'd appreciate it if you kept our conversation between us. And the bubbles. You can continue with that, if Arlo responds." Surprised, Ilara nodded. "Yes, Mr. Carver." As she closed the door behind her, she couldn't help but wonder what had just happened. Had she been granted permission to interact with Arlo? Or was Elliot Carver simply observing, collecting data like he might for one of his business ventures. Either way, she knew that something had shifted in the careful balance of the Carver estate, something that would be impossible to reverse. The bubble sessions, as Ilara came to think of them, became a morning ritual. Every day, just after dawn, Arlo would be waiting beneath the gum tree. Ilara would join him for exactly 15 minutes, blowing the precise number of bubbles he requested with his fingers. Some days it was as few as 2, other days as many as 12. She began to notice patterns. On rainy days, he always asked for 7. On particularly sunny mornings, always 5. What Ilara didn't know was that these interactions were being closely monitored. The discrete security cameras installed throughout the estate captured each session in high-definition detail, and in his study, Elliot Carver watched them with growing fascination. "He's making distinct choices," Dr. Helena Patel observed one morning, standing beside Elliot as they reviewed the footage. "The numbers aren't random, they're deliberate, and he's associating them with environmental factors." Dr. Patel had been working with Arlo for 6 months, the longest-lasting specialist in a series of many. A behavioral psychologist with a reputation for breakthrough work with non-verbal children, she had made more progress than most, but still nothing like what they were witnessing now. "Could you replicate this?" Elliot asked, his eyes fixed on the screen where his son was carefully holding up 9 fingers as sunlight filtered through morning clouds. Dr. Patel shook her head. "I've tried bubble activities before." He showed no interest. "There's something about her approach, or perhaps something about her, that he's responding to." Elliot frowned. "She has no qualifications." "Sometimes that's an advantage," Dr. Patel replied thoughtfully. "No preconceptions, no textbook methods, just pure human connection." Elliot turned from the screen, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Human connection was precisely what he'd been unable to establish with his own son. Despite every effort, every resource he'd employed, Arlo remained unreachable to him. The therapists called it trauma-induced selective mutism, exacerbated by signs of neurodivergence that had gone unnoticed before Diana's accident. "I want you to continue your regular sessions," Elliot said firmly, "but observe Mitchell's interactions as well. Take notes. See if there's something we can learn from her approach." Dr. Patel nodded, but there was a knowing look in her eyes that Elliot chose to ignore. Later that day, Ilara was polishing the banister in the main hall when she felt someone watching her. She turned to find Dr. Patel standing nearby, her expression friendly but appraising. "Miss Mitchell, isn't it?" The psychologist extended her hand. "I'm Helena Patel. I work with Arlo." Ilara wiped her hands on her apron before shaking the offered hand. "Yes, I know. I've seen you coming and going." "I was wondering if I might ask you a few questions," Dr. Patel said, her tone casual but her eyes intent. "About your interactions with Arlo. Mr. Carver mentioned you've established a rapport with him." Ilara stiffened. So Mr. Carver had been discussing her with Arlo's specialists. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. "I wouldn't call it a rapport exactly," Ilara said carefully. "We just blow bubbles sometimes, in the mornings." "And he responds to you, Doctor?" Patel pressed. "He makes requests with his fingers." "He counts," Ilara confirmed. "That's all." Dr. Patel smiled. "Ms. Mitchell, in the context of Arlo's condition, that's extraordinary. It's the first consistent, intentional communication he's initiated in over a year." Ilara absorbed this information silently, unsure how to respond. She'd known Arlo was silent, of course, but she hadn't fully grasped the significance of their bubble-counting ritual. "I'd like to observe one of your sessions," Dr. Patel continued. "Not interfere, just watch. Would that be all right with you?" Ilara hesitated. The morning sessions felt private, almost sacred, a fragile connection she was afraid might break under scrutiny. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said finally. "Arlo seems comfortable with just the 2 of us. I wouldn't want to disrupt that." Dr. Patel regarded her thoughtfully. "You're very protective of him." "I'm protective of his progress," Ilara corrected. "Whatever that might be. I'm not claiming to understand it." "But you do understand him," Dr. Patel said quietly. "Better than most of us, it seems." Before Ilara could respond, a commotion from outside drew their attention. Through the window they could see Arlo sitting on the ground near the rose garden, arms wrapped around his knees, rocking slightly. Maria the nanny stood over him, clearly distressed, while one of the gardeners hovered nearby, looking concerned. Dr. Patel moved quickly toward the door. and after a moment's hesitation, Ilara followed. Outside, the situation became clearer. A hedge trimmer lay on the ground near Arlo, the source apparently of his distress. The mechanical sound had triggered an overwhelming response. "He just started screaming," Maria was explaining frantically to Dr. Patel. "I tried to move him inside, but he wouldn't budge. He's been like this for 10 minutes now." Arlo wasn't screaming anymore, but his body language spoke volumes. The tight huddle, the rocking motion. The hands now pressed over his ears, though the trimmer was silent. "Give him space," Dr. Patel instructed, motioning for the gardener and Maria to back away. She crouched near Arlo, but didn't touch him. "Arlo, it's Dr. Helena. The noise is gone now. You're safe." The boy continued rocking, his face hidden against his knees. Ilara watched from a distance, her heart aching. Without conscious thought, she reached into her pocket where she still carried the bubble solution. Before she could reconsider, she approached and knelt several feet from Arlo, opposite Dr. Patel. "Arlo," she said softly, "would you like some bubbles?" Dr. Patel looked startled but didn't interfere. Slowly, Arlo lifted his head. His face was flushed, eyes red-rimmed, but the panic in them receded slightly at the sight of Ilara. With trembling fingers, he held up 3. Ilara nodded and carefully uncapped the bottle. 3 it is. She dipped the wand and blew gently. 3 perfect spheres drifted between them, catching the sunlight. Arlo's eyes locked onto them, his breathing gradually steadying as he tracked their movement. When they disappeared, he held up 5 fingers. 5 more, Ilara agreed, and blew another set of bubbles. They continued this exchange until Arlo had requested 21 bubbles in total, the most he'd ever asked for. By then, his body had relaxed, the rocking had ceased, and his hands no longer covered his ears. Dr. Patel observed the entire interaction in fascinated silence. When Arlo finally stood up, calm enough to be led inside by Maria, she turned to Ilara with newfound respect. "That was remarkable," she said quietly. "You provided exactly what he needed, a familiar routine, a sensory focus, and control over the situation." Ilara shrugged uncomfortably. "It was just bubbles." "No," Dr. Patel said firmly. "It was connection, and that's what Arlo has been missing." As they walked back toward the house, Dr. Patel added, "I won't insist on observing your morning sessions, but I would like to discuss your approach further if you're willing. Perhaps we can learn from each other." Ilara considered this. "I don't have an approach. I just treat him like a person who communicates differently, that's all." Dr. Patel smiled. "And that, Ms. Mitchell, may be exactly what we've been missing." From the window of his study, Elliot Carver had witnessed the entire scene. The distress, the intervention, the gradual calm that returned to his son's body through something as simple as soap bubbles. A tightness gripped his chest, part relief, part something more complicated. When Dr. Patel arrived for their scheduled meeting an hour later, her usual clinical detachment had given way to barely contained excitement. "I think we need to reconsider our approach," she said without preamble. "What I witnessed today wasn't just a calming technique, it was communication. Arlo is using the bubbles as a language." Elliot frowned. "A language of bubbles?" "Numbers," Dr. Patel clarified. "He's expressing himself through numbers. Today, when he was distressed, he requested 21 bubbles in total. That's significant. It's the most complex interaction he's initiated since the accident." Elliot's gaze drifted to the portrait of Diana on the wall. "My wife used to say that Arlo saw the world in patterns, numbers, shapes, colors. She understood it better than I ever could." Dr. Patel leaned forward. "Mr. Carver, I'd like to propose something unconventional. I believe Ms. Mitchell should be more involved in Arlo's daily routine, not as staff, but as," she searched for the right word, "a bridge between our professional interventions and his natural way of communicating." Elliot stiffened. "You're suggesting I elevate my housekeeper to a therapeutic role?" "I'm suggesting we recognize the therapeutic role she's already playing," Dr. Patel corrected gently. "What you choose to call it is up to you." After the psychologist left, Elliot remained at his desk, staring at the security footage still paused on his screen. Ilara Mitchell kneeling in the garden, Arlo counting with his small fingers, both of them focused on the rainbow-shimmered bubbles floating between them. He reached for his phone. "Judith, find Mitchell and send her to my office, please." 10 minutes later, Ilara stood before him, her hands clasped in front of her. Apron, her expression carefully neutral. "Dr. Patel thinks you should be more involved in Arlo's care," Elliot said without preamble. Ilara blinked, clearly taken aback. "I'm not qualified for that, Mr. Carver." "Apparently, qualifications aren't what my son responds to," Elliot replied, an edge of bitterness in his tone. "He responds to Bubbles. And to you." Ilara shifted uncomfortably. "I don't want to overstep." "You already have," Elliot interrupted, then sighed, running a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of vulnerability. "But it seems to be helping him, so I'm prepared to adjust your duties. You'll continue your current responsibilities, but I'd like you to spend 1 hour each day with Arlo, in addition to your morning ritual." Ilara stared at him, processing this unexpected development. "What would I do during this hour?" "Whatever you've been doing that's working," Elliot said simply. "Dr. Patel will coordinate with you on the specifics. Your salary will be adjusted accordingly, of course." "Mr. Carver," Ilara said carefully, "I care about Arlo's well-being, I truly do. But I'm concerned about creating expectations I can't fulfill. I'm not a therapist." "No," Elliot agreed, his gaze direct. "You're something my son apparently needs more right now." The new arrangement began the following Monday. Ilara would spend 1 hour with Arlo each afternoon, after his sessions with Dr. Patel and before dinner. The hour was loosely structured. They could be in the garden, the playroom, or the library, depending on Arlo's non-verbal cues and the weather. Ilara approached these sessions with a mixture of eagerness and trepidation. She had no formal training, no professional guidelines to follow. All she had was instinct and observation, and the growing conviction that somewhere behind Arlo's silence was a mind desperately trying to connect. On the first afternoon, she brought a collection of items to the playroom, the bubble solution, of course, but also a kaleidoscope, a small prism that cast rainbows when held to the light, and a picture book about colors. She arranged them on a low table and waited. Arlo entered cautiously, Maria hovering in the doorway, until Ilara nodded that everything was fine. The boy scanned the room, his gaze landing on the items Ilara had arranged. After a moment's consideration, he pointed to the prism. "Good choice," Ilara said, picking it up. "Would you like to see what it does?" She held it up to the sunlight streaming through the window. Immediately, a spectrum of colors danced across the wall. Arlo's eyes widened, and he moved closer to examine the phenomenon. Ilara placed the prism in his palm. "It's breaking the light into all the colors that are hidden inside it," she explained. Not certain how much he understood, but speaking to him as she would to any child. Like a secret rainbow waiting to be found. Arlo turned the prism slowly, watching as the rainbow shifted across the wall. Then, deliberately, he held up 7 fingers. "7 bubbles?" Ilara asked, reaching for the bottle. But Arlo shook his head, a gesture so normal, so communicative, that Ilara felt her heart skip. He pointed to the E, rainbow on the wall, then held up 7 fingers again. 7 colors? Ilara guessed. In the rainbow. Arlo didn't confirm or deny, but he lowered his hand and continued examining the prism. For the next several days, their sessions followed a similar pattern. Ilara would bring various items that played with light, color, or sound in gentle ways. Arlo would explore them, occasionally, indicating numbers with his fingers or pointing to specific elements that caught his attention. They developed a wordless rhythm of interaction that felt natural, unforced. By the end of the first week, Ilara had compiled a notebook of observations. Arlo's preferences, his patterns, the subtle ways he communicated through gesture and expression. She shared these with Dr. Patel during their brief meetings, and the psychologist incorporated them into her own sessions with the boy. "He's showing remarkable progress," Dr. Patel told Elliot during their weekly review. "The consistency of interaction with Ms. Mitchell is providing a foundation for him to build upon. He's more engaged in all his activities now, not just with her." Elliot studied the reports spread before him. "But he's still not speaking." "Speech may not be his primary mode of communication," Dr. Patel reminded him gently. "Many children on the spectrum." "We don't have a diagnosis," Elliot interrupted sharply. Dr. Patel's expression remained professional, but her tone firmed. "Mr. Carver, I understand your reluctance, but the evidence suggests that Arlo may be neurodivergent, in addition to experiencing trauma-induced selective mutism. Acknowledging this wouldn't diminish him. It would help us better support his natural way of experiencing the world." Elliot's jaw tightened. Diana always said he was just differently wired. She didn't want him labeled. "Your wife sounds like she had remarkable insight," Dr. Patel said carefully. And she was right. Arlo is differently wired. Beautifully so. But understanding the specific nature of those differences would help us tailor his support more effectively. After a long moment, Elliot nodded reluctantly, arranged the assessments discreetly. As the weeks passed, Ilara's sessions with Arlo evolved. She discovered his fascination with patterns. In nature, in music, in the play of light and shadow. She brought him books about the mathematical patterns in seashells and sunflowers, showed him how to create simple kaleidoscopes from cardboard tubes and broken bits of colored glass. One rainy afternoon, confined to the library, Ilara introduced him to a simple xylophone. She demonstrated how each key produced a different note, then let him explore. To her amazement, Arlo began tapping out patterns, not random noise, but deliberate sequences that he would repeat exactly 3 times each before moving to a new pattern. "He's creating algorithms," Dr. Patel explained when Ilara described this behavior. "Mathematical sequences expressed through sound. It's actually quite sophisticated." Ilara began bringing a small digital recorder to their sessions, capturing Arlo's musical patterns so she could play them back to him. He would listen intently, sometimes holding up fingers to indicate something. Though what exactly, Ilara couldn't always decipher. The household staff watched these developments with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Judith, the estate manager, remained coolly professional, but clearly disapproved of Ilara's elevated role. Maria, initially resentful, gradually softened as she witnessed Arlo's progress. "He actually looks for me now," she confided to Ilara one evening. "Makes eye contact when I speak to him. He never did that before." Only Elliot remained distant from these changes. He received reports, reviewed footage, nodded approval for adjusted schedules and new resources, but he rarely observed Ilara and Arlo together in person. When he did, he maintained a careful distance, as if afraid of disrupting a delicate experiment. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon, unusually warm for early winter. Ilara and Arlo were in the garden, experimenting with a new bubble wand that created multiple bubbles at once. Arlo was particularly engaged, following the cloud of bubbles with unusual animation, his hands occasionally reaching out as if to catch them. Ilara was so focused on his reaction that she didn't notice Elliot approaching until he was standing just a few meters away, watching them with an unreadable expression. "Mr. Carver," she acknowledged, lowering the bubble wand. Arlo turned at the sound of her voice, his gaze landing on his father. For a moment, the 3 of them formed a tableau. Ilara kneeling on the grass, Arlo standing beside her, Elliot towering above them both. "Don't stop on my account," Elliot said, his voice carefully neutral. "I was just passing by." But he didn't move on. Instead, he watched as Ilara resumed blowing bubbles, creating a swarm of tiny spheres that drifted toward Arlo on the gentle breeze. What happened next occurred so quickly that later, Ilara would question whether she'd imagined it. Arlo, still tracking the bubbles, took 3 deliberate steps toward his father. Then, raising his small hand, he pointed directly at Elliot, then at the bubble wand in Ilara's hand. The message was unmistakable. He wanted his father to join them. For several heartbeats, Elliot stood frozen, clearly caught off guard by his son's invitation. His eyes darted from Arlo to Ilara, then back to the small hand, still pointing insistently at the bubble wand. "I think he wants you to try," Ilara said softly, holding out the wand. Elliot hesitated, his expression a complex mixture of longing and fear. "I have a conference call in 10 minutes, he said, but made no move to leave. Arlo took another step toward him, his eyes fixed on his father's face with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. It was perhaps the most direct engagement he had initiated with Elliot since Diana's death. Something in Elliot's posture shifted. He glanced at his watch, then back at his son. 5 minutes, he conceded, stepping forward and accepting the bubble wand from Ilara's outstretched hand. He examined it awkwardly, clearly uncertain how to proceed. "I'm not sure I—" "Just dip it in the solution and blow gently," Ilara instructed, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the significance of the moment. "Like this." She demonstrated with a second wand she pulled from her pocket. Elliot mimicked her actions, his movements stiff. His first attempt produced no bubbles at all. He frowned, concentrating harder on his second try. A single wobbly bubble emerged, floating briefly before popping against a nearby leaf. Arlo tracked its short journey, then held up one finger. "He's counting," Ilara explained. "It's our game. He tells me how many bubbles he wants to see." Understanding dawned in Elliot's eyes. He looked at the single finger Arlo was holding up. "One bubble," he said, and blew again, producing another solitary sphere. Arlo nodded, an actual nod, and held up 2 fingers. "2 this time," Elliot said, his voice softer now. He dipped the wand and blew more confidently, creating 2 perfect bubbles that drifted toward Arlo. The boy followed their path, his expression intent but relaxed. When they disappeared, he held up 3 fingers, and so it continued, Elliot creating exactly the number of bubbles Arlo requested, the count rising gradually from 1 to 7. With each successful exchange, Elliot's posture loosened, his movements became more natural, and something in his face softened. Ilara watched them silently, sensing the fragile bridge being constructed between father and son. She was reluctant to speak or move, afraid of disrupting this delicate connection. "Sir," came Judith's voice from the path, shattering the moment. "Your conference call is about to begin." Elliot straightened immediately, the corporate mask sliding back into place. "Thank you, Judith." He handed the bubble wand back to Ilara, avoiding her eyes. To Arlo, he said stiffly, "That was nice. Perhaps we can do it again sometime." Arlo didn't respond, his gaze now fixed on the ground. "Dr. Patel's report is on your desk," Judith added, as Elliot passed her. "The preliminary assessment results." Elliot nodded sharply and disappeared into the house, leaving Ilara and Arlo in a silence that felt heavier than before. Judith lingered a moment longer, her gaze sweeping critically over the bubble-making paraphernalia. "Dinner is at 6, she reminded Ilara coolly. "Please ensure Arlo is cleaned up and ready on time." After she left, Ilara turned to Arlo, trying to recapture the spirit of their session. "Should we try the big wand now? The one that makes the giant bubbles?" But Arlo seemed withdrawn. The bright engagement of moments ago dimmed. He shook his head. Again, that clear, communicative gesture that had become more frequent in recent weeks, and pointed toward the house. "You want to go inside?" Ilara asked. He nodded, already turning toward the path. As she gathered their things, Ilara's mind replayed the interaction between father and son. There had been a moment, brief but unmistakable, when the stiff formality between them had cracked, revealing the possibility of something warmer. Then Judith had arrived, and the moment was lost. Inside, Ilara delivered Arlo to Maria for his pre-dinner routine, then headed to the kitchen to help with meal preparations, a task that had remained part of her duties despite her expanded role with Arlo. She was chopping vegetables when Dr. Patel found her an hour later. "Ms. Mitchell," the psychologist said, her expression troubled. "Could I speak with you?" They stepped into the small staff office adjacent to the kitchen. Dr. Patel closed the door before speaking. "I've just had a rather difficult conversation with Mr. Carver," she began, "about Arlo's assessment results." Ilara wiped her hands on a dishcloth. "And? The findings confirm what I suspected. Arlo shows clear indicators of being on the autism spectrum, with additional signs of selective mutism resulting from trauma. It's a dual diagnosis that explains his communication patterns and sensory sensitivities." "That seems helpful to know," Ilara said carefully, noting the psychologist's furrowed brow. "Isn't it?" Dr. Patel sighed. "Mr. Carver is resistant to the diagnosis. He's concerned about labeling Arlo, about defining him by what he sees as deficits rather than strengths. It's not an uncommon reaction from parents. But you said understanding these differences would help support Arlo better." "Exactly. And that's where you come in." Dr. Patel leaned against the desk, her expression earnest. "Elliot respects your connection with Arlo. He's seen the progress. If you could help him understand that this diagnosis isn't limiting Arlo, but rather giving us a map to help him thrive." Ilara shook her head. "That's not my place, Dr. Patel. Mr. Carver barely tolerates my current role. He certainly wouldn't welcome my opinions on how he should process his son's diagnosis. Perhaps not directly," Dr. Patel conceded, "but in your daily interactions with Arlo, you could demonstrate the strengths of his neurodivergent perspective. Help Elliot see the beauty in the way his son experiences the world." Before Ilara could respond, the door opened and Judith appeared. Mr. Carver would like to see you in his study, Miss Mitchell, immediately. The estate manager's tone left no room for questions. With an apologetic glance at Dr. Patel, Ilara smoothed her apron and followed Judith through the house to Elliot's study. She found him standing at the window, his back to the door. The assessment report lay open on his desk, certain phrases highlighted in yellow: autism spectrum disorder, trauma response, alternative communication. Methods. You wanted to see me, Mr. Carver? Ilara said quietly. Elliot turned, his expression unreadable. Dr. Patel thinks Arlo is autistic. Ilara chose her words carefully. I understand she shared her assessment with you. What do you think? He asked abruptly. The question caught her off guard. I'm not qualified to have an opinion on a medical diagnosis, sir. That hasn't stopped you from forming a connection with my son that no qualified professional has managed to establish, Elliot said, a hint of bitterness in his tone. So I'll ask again. What do you think? Ilara took a deep breath. I think Arlo is exactly who he's meant to be. He sees the world differently. Patterns, numbers, light, sound, they all mean something special to him. Whether that's called autism or not, doesn't change who he is. Elliot's jaw tightened. Diana didn't want this for him. The labels, the therapy, the otherness. With all due respect, Mr. Carver, Ilara said gently, Arlo's differences aren't something that happened to him. They're part of who he is, and from what I've seen, they give him a beautiful perspective on the world. Elliot was silent for a long moment, his gaze returning to the window where the last light of day was fading over the vineyard. I saw him today, he said finally. Really saw him, perhaps for the first time since... He didn't finish the sentence. Those bubbles, such a simple thing. Yet, when he asked me to join you, when he counted 1, 2, 3, Elliot's voice caught. It felt like a conversation, the first real one we've had in so long. Ilara remained silent, sensing that anything she might say would only disrupt his fragile openness. I don't know how to reach him, Elliot admitted, so quietly she barely heard him. Not the way you do. You reached him today, Ilara said simply. You accepted his invitation. You played his game by his rules. That's all he wants, to be met where he is. Elliot turned to face her fully, his expression vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. The board is pressuring me to return to Sydney. The company needs a more visible presence at headquarters. But moving Arlo now, disrupting the progress he's made here. He left the thought unfinished, but Ilara understood the implication. The estate in Hunter Valley had been a retreat, a place to heal after Diana's death. But Elliot's business empire required his attention, and sooner or later decisions would have to be made. Mr. Carver, Ilara said carefully, whatever you decide, consistency will be important for Arlo. The routines, the familiar environments, the people he's connected with, these provide security for him. Elliot nodded slowly. Yes, Dr. Patel said something similar. He paused, seeming to reach a decision. Which is why I'm considering a proposition. If we were to relocate to Sydney, would you be willing to come with us? To continue working with Arlo in the same capacity? The question stunned Ilara into momentary silence. Leave the Hunter Valley? Follow the Carvers to Sydney? It was the last thing she'd expected. I don't know, she stammered. That's quite a significant change. Consider it, Elliot said, his business tone returning. The compensation would be appropriate to the role, of course. You'd be classified as Arlo's support specialist rather than household staff. Ilara nodded, her mind racing. I'll need some time to think about it. Of course. Elliot glanced at his watch. That will be all for now, Mitchell. As Ilara turned to leave, he added, and thank you for today, for all of it. Over the next week, Ilara found herself at a crossroads. The offer to relocate to Sydney and continue working with Arlo represented both opportunity and uncertainty. Her small cottage in Cessnock was humble, but it was hers, the first place she'd truly called home after years of living in staff quarters at various estates. Yet when she thought of leaving Arlo, of breaking the fragile connection they'd established, something inside her ached. She'd seen him emerge from his shell, watched him develop new ways of communicating, witnessed moments of joy that had been absent when she first arrived at the estate. You don't owe them anything, her sister Maddie insisted during their weekly phone call. You've already gone above and beyond what any housekeeper would be expected to do. It's not about owing, Ilara replied, gazing out her cottage window at the distant lights of neighboring vineyards. It's about She struggled to articulate the feeling. It's about seeing something through. Just be careful, Maddie warned. These wealthy families, they take what they need from people like us, then discard them when it's convenient. Remember the Hendersons? Ilara did. Remember, 3 years of loyal service to the Henderson family in Pokolbin, only to be let go with minimal notice when they decided to sell their vineyard and move overseas. It had been a painful lesson in the transactional nature of service relationships. This is different, Ilara said, though a seed of doubt had been planted. The following morning, she arrived at the estate to find an unusual flurry of activity. Staff moved purposefully between the main house and the east wing, carrying documents and equipment. Judith intercepted Ilara at the staff entrance, her expression tense. "There's been a development," she said curtly. "Mr. Carver has had to return to Sydney immediately. A situation with one of the overseas investments. He left at dawn." "What about Arlo?" Ilara asked, immediately concerned. "He's still here. Maria is with him." Judith consulted her tablet. "Mr. Carver has instructed that Arlo's routine continue unchanged. Your sessions are to proceed as scheduled. Dr. Patel has been notified and will be arriving this afternoon as usual." Ilara nodded, relieved but troubled by Elliot's sudden departure. "How long will Mr. Carver be gone?" "That's not your concern," Judith replied coolly. "Just focus on your duties." But as the day progressed, Ilara sensed the shift in the household atmosphere. Staff whispered in corners, exchanging worried glances. Even Maria seemed on edge when Ilara collected Arlo for their afternoon session. "Is everything all right?" Ilara asked her. Maria glanced down the hallway before responding in a hushed tone. "There's talk of financial troubles. Something about investors pulling out after negative press. I don't know the details, but..." She shrugged meaningfully. "The timing of his departure wasn't planned, that's for sure." Ilara tried to keep this information from affecting her session with Arlo, but the boy seemed to sense the tension in the household. He was more withdrawn than usual, showing little interest in the activities that normally engaged him. When she offered the bubble wand, he turned away, moving instead to the window where he pressed his palm against the glass, staring out at the vineyard. "Your dad will be back soon," Ilara said gently, coming to stand beside him. "He had to go to Sydney for work." Arlo didn't respond, but his fingers curled against the glass, a small gesture of distress. That broke Ilara's heart. That evening, after Arlo had gone to bed, Dr. Patel convened a brief meeting with Ilara, Maria, and Judith in the small conference room off the main hall. "I've spoken with Elliot," the psychologist began, her professional demeanor firmly in place despite the unusual circumstances. "He's asked me to coordinate Arlo's care while he's away. The situation in Sydney is complicated. He may be there for several weeks." "Weeks?" Maria exclaimed. "But Arlo needs stability, routine." "Which is exactly what we're going to provide," Dr. Patel said firmly. "Nothing changes in Arlo's daily schedule. Ms. Mitchell will continue her sessions. I'll maintain my regular visits, and Maria, you'll handle all other aspects of his care as usual." Judith cleared her throat. "There's also the matter of staffing. Mr. Carver has instructed me to review all operational expenses while he's addressing the company situation. Non-essential personnel may need to be furloughed temporarily." Ilara felt a chill at these words. "And who determines what's non-essential?" Judith's gaze was steady. "Mr. Carver has provided guidelines. Dr. Patel and I will make the final decisions, based on Arlo's needs and the estate's operational requirements." The implication was clear. Ilara's position might be under review. Over the next few days, the estate staff was indeed reduced. The second gardener was let go, as was one of the kitchen staff and the weekend housekeeping assistant. Each departure added to the atmosphere of uncertainty that permeated the property. Despite this, Ilara remained focused on Arlo. If anything, their sessions took on greater importance as the rest of his world shifted around him. She maintained their routines with careful consistency, introducing new activities only gradually and always returning to the familiar comfort of their bubble-counting ritual. A week after Elliot's departure, Dr. Patel arrived for her regular session with Arlo looking unusually serious. She pulled Ilara aside before collecting the boy from the library. "There's been another development," she said quietly. "Elliot has asked me to prepare Arlo for a possible visit to Sydney, just for a weekend, to see his father." Ilara felt an immediate concern. "Is that wise? With everything so uncertain right now?" "I share your reservations," Dr. Patel admitted. "But Elliot, is insistent. He misses his son, and frankly, I think he needs the emotional support, even if he wouldn't frame it that way. Arlo isn't equipped to provide emotional support to adults, Ilara said sharply, then caught herself. I'm sorry, that was out of line. Dr. Patel smiled sadly. No, you're right, and I've made that point to Elliot. But there's another factor at play. She lowered her voice further. Diana's parents have filed for increased visitation rights. They're using Elliot's extended absence as leverage. The grandparents? Ilara had heard them mentioned only in passing. I didn't realize they were involved in Arlo's life. They weren't until recently. After Diana's death, there was a period of estrangement, but now they're seeking legal recognition of their relationship with Arlo. If Elliot appears to be neglecting his parental responsibilities by remaining in Sydney, they could gain greater access, Ilara finished, understanding the implication. Dr. Patel nodded. Hence the visit. It would demonstrate Elliot's continued involvement in Arlo's life. Ilara considered this information carefully. When would this visit occur? This weekend. Ideally, Judith would accompany him. Not Maria, Ilara asked, surprised. Maria has family obligations she can't reschedule, Dr. Patel explained, and Judith has worked with Elliot longer. He trusts her judgment. A thought formed in Ilara's mind. Risky, perhaps, but driven by genuine concern for Arlo's well-being. What if I went with him instead, she suggested. Arlo is comfortable with me. I could help manage his routine, maintain the strategies we've been developing. Judith doesn't have that specific experience with him. Dr. Patel studied her thoughtfully. That's actually an excellent suggestion. I'll propose it to Elliot. She hesitated before adding, it might also be an opportunity for you to see the Sydney residents, to help with your decision about relocating. Ilara nodded. Though the decision felt increasingly complicated, the financial uncertainty surrounding Elliot's business cast a shadow over any potential move. If the company was struggling, how secure would her position really be? 2 days later, the arrangements were confirmed. Ilara would accompany Arlo to Sydney for a 3-day visit, departing Friday morning and returning Sunday evening. Judith was clearly displeased with the change in plans, but even she couldn't argue with Dr. Patel's professional assessment that Arlo would travel better with someone he trusted. As Ilara packed a small bag on Thursday evening, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Hello? She answered cautiously. Miss Mitchell. Elliot Carver's voice was instantly recognizable, though it sounded strained. I wanted to speak with you directly about tomorrow's arrangements. Of course, Mr. Carver, Ilara replied, surprised by the personal call. The driver will collect you and Arlo at 9. The journey takes about 2 hours, but we'll stop if needed. He spoke efficiently, like a man checking items off a list. Dr. Patel has forwarded Arlo's schedule and requirements. The Sydney house staff have been briefed. I understand, Ilara said. Is there anything specific you'd like me to bring for Arlo? Anything that might help him feel more comfortable in a new environment? There was a pause on the line, as if the question had caught Elliot off guard. His comfort items are already packed, he said finally. But perhaps the bubbles. He seems to find them calming. I'll bring them, Ilara assured him. Another pause, longer this time. Ms. Mitchell, Elliot began, his tone shifting to something less formal. I want to thank you for doing this, for being willing to help Arlo through this transition. Things in Sydney are complicated at the moment. Your presence will make a significant difference. The sincerity in his voice was unexpected. I'm happy to help, Ilara replied simply. Arlo's well-being is what matters most. Yes, Elliot agreed quietly. It is. After they disconnected, Ilara sat on the edge of her bed, turning her phone over in her hands. For the first time, she had glimpsed something beneath Elliot Carver's controlled exterior. A father worried about his son, a man possibly facing professional setbacks, someone needing support. He was too proud to directly request. The trip to Sydney suddenly felt weightier than a simple weekend visit. It represented a turning point, though in what direction, Ilara couldn't yet determine. The black sedan moved smoothly through the Hunter Valley landscape, vineyards giving way to suburbs as they approached Sydney. In the back seat, Ilara sat beside Arlo, who stared out the window with solemn fascination. He hadn't shown any distress at leaving the estate. If anything, he seemed unusually alert, his gaze tracking the changing scenery with intense focus. We're about 40 minutes from the city now, the driver informed them, catching Ilara's eye in the rearview mirror. "Mr. Carver suggested we take the coastal route. It's a bit longer but offers better views." "Thank you," Ilara replied. "I think Arlo would enjoy that." As if on cue, Arlo pressed his palm against the window as they rounded a bend and the Pacific Ocean came into view, a vast blue expanse glittering under the morning sun. His eyes widened, and he tapped the glass 3 times with his index finger. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Ilara said softly. "That's the ocean. Much bigger than the pond at the estate," Arlo continued, watching the water as they drove along the coastal road, his usual stillness replaced by a subtle animation. Small shifts in posture, occasional pointing, the gentle tapping of fingers against the window whenever something caught his attention. When the Sydney Harbour Bridge appeared on the horizon, Ilara felt a flutter of anticipation herself. It had been years since she'd visited the city and, never under circumstances like these. "We'll be crossing the bridge soon," she told Arlo. "Then we'll see the Opera House. It looks like giant seashells." As they approached the iconic structure, Arlo leaned forward in his seat, his gaze fixed on the white sail-shaped roofs. When they passed directly beside it, he held up 5 fingers toward Ilara. 5 points, she said, understanding his observation. "Yes, I think you're right. The roof has 5 main sections like your fingers." The driver glanced back curiously but said nothing, continuing through the city centre toward the eastern suburbs. The Carver residence in Sydney was nothing like the Hunter Valley estate. Where the country property sprawled horizontally across the landscape, the Sydney home rose vertically. A sleek, modern building perched on a cliff in Vaucluse, offering panoramic views of the harbour and city skyline. Glass and steel dominated the architecture, creating an impression of transparency that contrasted sharply with the solid sandstone walls of the Hunter Valley mansion. As they pulled into the private driveway, Ilara saw a familiar figure waiting on the steps. Elliot Carver, dressed in a casual, but perfectly tailored outfit that managed to look both relaxed and impeccable. His expression as he watched the car approach was a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The driver opened Arlo's door first. The boy remained seated, staring up at the imposing structure before him. "Welcome to Sydney, Arlo," Elliot said, his voice carefully modulated to sound cheerful without being overwhelming. "I've been looking forward to showing you the house." Arlo made no move to exit the car. Ilara unbuckled her own seatbelt and leaned toward him. "It's all right," she said softly. "It's just a different house. Your dad has been staying here while he works in the city." Slowly, Arlo slid toward the door. When his feet touched the ground, he looked up at the glass facade once more, then at his father. There was no smile, no obvious recognition, but he didn't resist when Elliot tentatively extended his hand. "Let's go inside," Elliot suggested. "You can see your room. It has a view of the harbour." Arlo didn't take his father's hand, but he did follow him up the steps. Ilara trailed behind, carrying her small overnight bag and Arlo's backpack. The interior of the house was just as impressive as its exterior. Open spaces, minimalist furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the panoramic views into living artwork. But despite its grandeur, the space felt transient, lacking the lived-in quality of the Hunter Valley home. No family photographs adorned the walls, no personal items cluttered the surfaces. It was a beautiful shell, designed to impress rather than comfort. A slender woman with a clipboard approached as they entered the foyer. "Welcome back, Mr. Carver. Everything has been prepared according to your instructions." "Thank you, Vanessa," Elliot replied. "This is Ms. Mitchell, Arlo's support specialist. She'll be staying in the guest suite adjacent to Arlo's room." "Of course." Vanessa nodded professionally toward Ilara. "I've stocked the kitchen with the dietary preferences you specified, and the daily schedule has been distributed to all staff. Is there anything else you require?" Before Ilara could respond, Arlo wandered toward the massive living room window, drawn by the harbour view. He pressed his hands against the glass, his small silhouette framed against the expanse of water and city skyline. "I think we're fine for now," Elliot said, his gaze following his son. "Could you show Ms. Mitchell to her room? I'd like a moment with Arlo." Vanessa led Ilara up a floating staircase to the 2nd floor, where a sleek corridor connected several doorways. "Arlo's room is here." She indicated a door painted a soft blue, the only spot of color in the otherwise monochromatic hallway. "And your suite is right next door. Mr. Carver wanted to ensure you'd be close by if Arlo needed anything during the night." The guest suite was larger than Ilara's entire cottage, with its own sitting area, ensuite bathroom, and private balcony overlooking the harbour. The luxury might have been intimidating, if not for the thoughtful touches that had clearly been added for her arrival. A basket of local fruits, a selection of books on the bedside table, and a small vase of native flowers that reminded her of the Hunter Valley Gardens. "Mr. Carver mentioned you enjoy reading," Vanessa said, noticing Ilara's glance toward the books. The titles were selected based on similar volumes in the estate library. The personal consideration surprised Ilara. "Thank you, that's very thoughtful. Dinner will be at 6 in the main dining room," Vanessa continued. Mr. Carver thought it best to maintain Arlo's regular schedule as much as possible. "Is there anything specific you require in the meantime?" Ilara shook her head. "I think we'll be fine. I'd like to unpack Arlo's things, help him get settled." After Vanessa departed, Ilara took a moment to absorb her surroundings. The contrast between this pristine architectural space and her humble cottage was stark. Yet beneath the luxury she sensed an emptiness, the absence of the personal touches that transform a house into a home. She found Elliot and Arlo still in the living room, Elliot pointing out landmarks visible from the window: the Opera House, the Harbour Bridge, the Royal Botanic Gardens. Arlo listened with his typical silence, but his attentive posture suggested interest. "There's a colony of bats that lives in the Botanic Gardens," Elliot was saying. "Thousands of them. They're called flying foxes. At sunset you can see them leaving the trees to hunt for food." Arlo tapped the glass, pointing toward the green expanse of the gardens. "Would you like to see them?" Elliot asked. "We could visit tomorrow." Arlo didn't respond directly, but he continued looking in that direction, which Elliot seemed to interpret as interest. "I've scheduled a light day tomorrow," he told Ilara as she approached. "Morning at the house, perhaps a visit to the Botanic Gardens in the afternoon, if Arlo seems amenable. Sunday we have a brief brunch engagement with the Harringtons, close family friends, before your return to the valley." "That sounds manageable," Ilara agreed cautiously. "Though I'd suggest we remain flexible, ready to adjust if Arlo shows signs of overwhelm." Elliot nodded. "Of course. Diana's parents will also be at the brunch on Sunday." His tone remained neutral, but Ilara caught the tension beneath it. "They're eager to see Arlo." "I understand," Ilara said carefully. "It might help if I knew a bit more about their relationship with him, to better support the interaction." Elliot's expression tightened. "The Blackwoods have always been particular. Diana was their only child. When she married me, they had certain expectations about our lifestyle, our values." He glanced at Arlo, ensuring the boy was still absorbed in the view before continuing in a lower voice. "They never approved of our decision to raise Arlo in the Hunter Valley. Thought it was too isolated, too far from proper schools and social opportunities. After Diana's death, they pushed for him to live with them in their Mosman home. And now they're seeking legal visitation rights," Ilara supplied, recalling Dr. Patel's information. "Yes, they believe I'm incapable of providing the stability Arlo needs." A flash of vulnerability crossed Elliot's features. Perhaps recent events have given them additional ammunition. Before Ilara could respond, Arlo turned from the window and approached them. He looked at Ilara, then deliberately held up his hands, fingers splayed. "10?" Ilara asked. "10 bubbles?" Arlo nodded. "Of course," she smiled, reaching into her pocket for the small bottle she'd brought. "Let's find a good spot." They moved to an area of the living room away. From the furniture, Ilara uncapped the bottle and dipped the wand. Aware of Elliot watching them intently, she blew a stream of 10 bubbles that floated through the sunlight, streaming from the windows, their surfaces reflecting rainbow prisms across the white walls. Arlo followed them with his gaze, his expression peaceful. When the last bubble popped, he turned to his father and held up 10 fingers again. Elliot looked momentarily startled, then understanding dawned. "You want me to try?" Arlo waited, hands still raised. "I don't have a wand," Elliot said hesitantly. Ilara offered hers. "Here." With a self-conscious glance at Ilara, Elliot accepted the wand and dipped it in the solution. His technique had improved since their garden interaction. He blew a perfect stream of 10 bubbles that drifted toward Arlo. The boy watched them float past, then held up 5 fingers toward his father and 5 toward Ilara. "I think he wants us to each do 5, Ilara interpreted. They took turns, creating exactly the number of bubbles Arlo requested, the 3 of them forming an unlikely circle in the austere living room. With each exchange, Elliot's movements became more natural, his expression softening. Diana used to blow bubbles for him, he said quietly as Arlo tracked a particularly large sphere across the room. On the terrace at the Valley House, before he could even walk, he would laugh every time they popped. He still enjoys the sensory experience, Ilara observed. The way they catch the light, their unpredictable movements, the gentle sound when they disappear. It's a complete contained experience, with a beginning, middle, and end. Elliot looked at her curiously. You understand him so intuitively. I just pay attention, Ilara replied simply. Arlo communicates constantly, just not in the ways most people expect. The bubble blowing continued until Arlo indicated he was finished by capping the bottle himself, a new behavior that suggested growing confidence. He then walked to the sofa and climbed onto it, picking up a tablet that had been placed there earlier. He seems comfortable here, Elliot observed, sounding relieved. I wasn't sure how he'd react to the change in environment. Children are often more adaptable than we give them credit for, Ilara said, especially when they feel secure in their key relationships. Elliot's phone buzzed, breaking the moment. He checked the screen, his expression immediately shifting back to business mode. I need to take this. Investor call. I should be about an hour. After he strode from the room, Ilara joined Arlo on the sofa. He was using an app she recognized from their sessions at the estate, one that created geometric patterns based on touch interactions. His small fingers moved precisely across the screen, generating symmetrical mandalas in vibrant colors. This is a beautiful place, isn't it? She said conversationally, not expecting a response. Very different from the valley, but special in its own way. To her surprise, Arlo nodded without looking up from his tablet. You like it here? She asked gently. He tilted his head slightly, a gesture she'd come to recognize, as consideration rather than confusion. Then he pointed toward the window at the harbor view. The water, Ilara guessed, or the view. Arlo held up 2 fingers. The view, she confirmed. It is spectacular. The rest of the day passed quietly. Arlo explored the house at his own pace, Ilara following at a respectful distance. He showed particular interest in the architectural features, the spiral staircase, the recessed lighting, the way shadows played across the white walls as the sun moved. He didn't seem disturbed by the new environment. If anything, he appeared stimulated by it in a positive way. Dinner was a somewhat formal affair, despite Elliot's attempts to keep it relaxed. The dining room, with its long table and harbor views, felt designed for entertaining rather than family meals. Arlo ate little, but this wasn't unusual. He sat quietly, occasionally glancing between his father and Ilara. I was thinking, Elliot said as dessert was served, perhaps we could set up a similar arrangement in this house for your sessions with Arlo, if you decided to accept the position in Sydney. Ilara noted how carefully he phrased it, not assuming her decision, but opening the possibility. That could work, she agreed neutrally, though it would need some adaptations. This environment is very different from the estate. In what way? Elliot asked, genuinely curious. The estate has natural elements integrated throughout. Gardens visible from every window, natural materials, softer acoustics. This space is more, she searched for a diplomatic word, contemporary, more urban, and that's less suitable for Arlo. Not necessarily, Ilara clarified, just different. He seems to appreciate the architectural features here, but for ongoing comfort we might consider creating a dedicated space with some of the sensory elements he responds to at the estate. Elliot nodded thoughtfully. That could be arranged. The 3rd floor has a room with excellent natural light. It's currently unused. The conversation drifted to practical matters. Arlo's schedule for the weekend, the planned outings, the Sunday brunch with the Blackwoods. Throughout, Ilara was struck by Elliot's attention to detail regarding his son's needs, despite his obvious preoccupation with business matters. After dinner, Ilara helped Arlo through his bedtime routine in his new room, a space that, like the rest of the house, was beautifully designed, but lacking personal touches. She read him a story from one of the books they'd brought from the valley, then wished him good night. As she closed his door, she found Elliot waiting in the hallway. Is he settled? He asked quietly. Yes, Ilara replied. He seemed tired but not anxious. The day went well. Elliot nodded, relief evident in his features. Better than I expected, honestly. Would you join me for a moment? There's something I'd like to discuss. Elliot led Ilara to a small study adjacent to the master bedroom. Unlike the rest of the house, this room felt personal. Bookshelves lined the walls, family photographs sat on the desk, and a worn leather armchair occupied one corner. It was a sanctuary, Ilara realized, a private space where Elliot Carver could set aside the polished veneer he presented to the world. "Please sit," he gestured to the armchair while taking a seat behind the desk. "Can I offer you anything? Tea? Something stronger?" "Tea would be nice," Ilara replied, still absorbing the unexpected intimacy of the space. Elliot pressed a discreet button on the desk phone. "Vanessa, could you bring tea for 2 to the study?" After receiving confirmation, he turned his attention back to Ilara. "I wanted to speak with you privately, away from the staff, about Arlo and about the situation at Carver Energy." Ilara nodded, waiting for him to continue. "First, I want to thank you for coming to Sydney. Your presence has clearly made a difference for Arlo. The way he responded today..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's the most engaged I've seen him in a new environment since before Diana's death." "He's making progress," Ilara agreed, "but it's his progress, not mine. I'm just providing consistency." Elliot smiled slightly. "You undersell your contribution, but I appreciate the sentiment." His expression grew more serious. "The reason I wanted to speak with you is that circumstances have changed since I first proposed your relocation to Sydney." Ilara felt a flutter of anxiety. "Changed how?" "Carver Energy is facing challenges. A major overseas project has encountered regulatory hurdles. Simultaneously, one of our primary investors has withdrawn support, citing concerns about management stability." Elliot's professional tone couldn't quite mask the personal weight of this disclosure. "The company isn't in danger of collapse, but we are in a period of restructuring." "I see," Ilara said carefully. "And how does this affect Arlo?" "That's precisely the question I've been wrestling with," Elliot admitted. "The Sydney position would require my full attention for at least the next year. 18-hour days, frequent international travel, not conducive to providing Arlo with the stability he needs." A knock at the door interrupted them. Vanessa entered with a tea tray, set it on the desk, and departed silently. Elliot poured for both of them before continuing. "There are essentially 3 options. First, Arlo remains at the Hunter Valley estate with the current support structure, including your sessions, while I commute on weekends when possible. Second, Arlo relocates to Sydney with appropriate support, ideally including you, and I adjust my schedule to maximize our time together despite the professional demands. Or third," he hesitated, and Ilara sensed they had reached the crux of the conversation. "Diana's parents have proposed that Arlo stay with them during this transitional period. They have a stable household, financial resources, and genuine affection for him. They've even offered to bring you on as his support specialist if that would ease the transition." Ilara set down her teacup, surprised by this last revelation. "They've specifically asked for me to be involved?" "They've been thoroughly briefed on Arlo's progress," Elliot explained. "Dr. Patel has shared her observations, including the positive impact of your work with him. The Blackwoods are many things, but they're not blind to what's best for Arlo. If that includes your involvement, they're willing to accommodate it." "Have you made a decision?" Ilara asked quietly. Elliot's gaze drifted to a photograph on his desk. Diana holding a toddler Arlo on a beach, both of them laughing into the camera. "Not yet. I wanted to discuss it with you first. Your perspective on what would be least disruptive for Arlo is valuable to me." The trust implicit in this statement wasn't lost on Ilara. Elliot Carver, a man who controlled a global energy empire, was asking her, his son's former housekeeper, for guidance on one of the most significant decisions of his life. "Without knowing the Blackwoods, I can't fully assess that option," Ilara said thoughtfully, "but I can tell you that Arlo has made remarkable progress at the estate. The familiar environment, the natural setting, the established routines, they provide a foundation for him to build upon. Changing that foundation now could potentially set back that progress." "That's my concern as well," Elliot agreed. "Yet the estate was never meant to be our permanent home. It was a retreat after Diana's death, a place to heal. Eventually, I always intended for us to return to Sydney." "Perhaps the question isn't about location," Ilara suggested carefully. "Perhaps it's about priorities during this difficult period. What does Arlo need most right now? Stability in his environment or proximity to his father despite the professional demands that would limit your actual time together?" Elliot considered this, his expression troubled. When Diana died, I thought I could solve everything with resources, the best specialists, the perfect environment, every advantage money could buy, but none of it reached him. Not until you and your bubbles. He smiled faintly at the memory. What Arlo needs most is connection. Genuine human connection, and I'm not sure I can provide that adequately while salvaging the company. A sudden thought occurred to Alara. Mr. Carver, may I ask a personal question? He looked surprised but nodded. Why did you name your company Carver Energy? Was it a family business? No, he replied, seeming puzzled by the change in topic. I founded it myself about 15 years ago. The name was Diana's suggestion, actually. She said that energy companies typically had abstract, technical names, but putting our family name on it would make it personal. A reminder that behind the corporate structure were real people with real responsibilities. That's exactly my point, Ilara said gently. Your company bears your name because it represents your values, your vision. It's an extension of who you are. But so is Arlo. The difference is that the company has many people who can steward it through difficult times. Arlo has only one father. Elliot was silent for a long moment, absorbing her words. You're suggesting I should prioritize Arlo over the company, he said finally, even if that means stepping back from daily operations during this critical period. I'm suggesting there might be a middle path, Ilara clarified, one that doesn't require choosing between your son and your legacy. Perhaps the Hunter Valley estate continues as Arlo's primary residence, with you restructuring your work to allow for significant time there, rather than brief weekend visits. Modern technology allows for remote management of many aspects of business. You make it sound simple, Elliot said with a rueful smile. Not simple, Ilara acknowledged, but perhaps necessary for both of you. Elliot's phone buzzed again, the third time since they'd entered the study. He glanced at it but didn't pick up. The board chairman, he explained. We have a strategy session at 7 tomorrow morning. The demands never cease. Which is precisely why intentional choices are necessary, Ilara observed. Otherwise the urgent will always override the important. Elliot studied her. With newfound curiosity. You're rather philosophical for a housekeeper. Literature degree, Ilara reminded him with a small smile. Besides, raising siblings after my parents died taught me a few things about priorities. I didn't know about your parents, Elliot said quietly. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago, Ilara replied, but it shaped me, made me understand that time with those we love is precious and finite. Something shifted in Elliot's expression, a recognition perhaps of the universal truth in her words. He was silent for several moments, his gaze returning to the photograph of Diana and Arlo. I've been approaching this all wrong, he said finally, treating it as a logistical problem to be solved rather than a human connection to be nurtured. He looked back at Ilara, thank you for your perspective. It's given me much to consider. The conversation turned to more immediate matters, the details of the weekend ahead, particularly the Sunday brunch with the Blackwoods. Elliot provided context about Diana's parents, James Blackwood, a retired judge, and Margaret Blackwood, a former university administrator. Both were in their 70s, traditional in their values and deeply affected by their daughter's death. They blame me, Elliot admitted. Not directly, but I sense it. If I hadn't insisted on the Hunter Valley property, if we'd stayed in Sydney, perhaps the accident wouldn't have happened. That's not fair to you, Ilara said gently. Accidents happen everywhere, perhaps. But grief isn't rational. Elliot's voice held a weary acceptance. They've channeled theirs into concern for Arlo. They believe they can provide what I cannot, a stable, conventional upbringing in Sydney, with the best schools, proper social circles. And what do you believe would be best for Arlo? Ilara asked. Elliot considered the question carefully. I believe Arlo needs space to be exactly who he is, not who society expects him to be, not who his grandparents want him to be, not even who I might have imagined he would be, just himself with all his unique perspectives and ways of experiencing the world. It was perhaps the most honest statement Ilara had heard from him, a glimpse of the father beneath the businessman. Then that's what you should fight for, she said simply. As their conversation concluded, Elliot walked Ilara back to the guest wing. At Arlo's door they paused to listen. No sounds came from within. He was sleeping peacefully. Good night, Miss Mitchell, Elliot said formally, though his eyes held a warmth that hadn't been there before. And thank you again For everything. Good night, Mr. Carver, Ilara replied, watching as he retreated down the hallway toward the master's suite, his shoulders straighter than they had been earlier, as if some burden had been partially lifted. The next morning dawned clear and bright, Sydney Harbour glistening under a perfect blue sky. Elliot had departed for his board meeting before Ilara and Arlo woke, leaving a note with Vanessa that he would return by lunchtime. The morning passed quietly, with Arlo exploring more of the house under Ilara's watchful eye. He showed particular interest in a grand piano in the music room, pressing keys individually and listening to each note with focused attention. "Do you like music, Arlo?" Ilara asked, sitting beside him on the bench. He didn't respond verbally, but he pressed 3 keys in sequence, a simple, pleasing chord. "That sounds nice," Ilara encouraged. "Would you like to try more?" Arlo repeated the same 3 notes, then added 2 more. Then he started the sequence again. After several repetitions, Ilara recognized that he was creating a pattern, not random notes, but a deliberate, mathematical progression. She was so absorbed in watching his musical exploration that she didn't notice Elliot standing in the doorway until he spoke. "Diana played," he said quietly, entering the room. "Not professionally, but beautifully. She would sit with Arlo just like that, letting him experiment with sounds." Arlo continued his pattern, seemingly unaware of his father's arrival. Elliot moved closer, standing behind the piano bench. "She believed music was a language he would understand even before words," Elliot continued, his voice soft with memory. "I thought it was just a mother's wishful thinking. But watching him now." Arlo completed his sequence, then turned his head slightly, acknowledging his father's presence without making eye contact, a habit Ilara had noticed often. "I'm back early," Elliot explained, though Arlo hadn't asked. "The meeting concluded more quickly than expected. I thought perhaps we could visit the Botanic Gardens this afternoon, as we discussed. The weather is perfect." "For it." Arlo didn't respond, but he slid off the piano bench and moved to the window, looking out at the harbour as if considering the proposition. "I think that's a yes," Ilara interpreted, catching Elliot's eye with a small smile. The outing was arranged for after lunch, a light meal on the terrace overlooking the harbour. Vanessa had prepared a picnic basket for them to take to the gardens, and a pay driver was scheduled to collect them at 2 o'clock. As they ate, Ilara noticed a subtle change in Elliot's demeanour. The tense, preoccupied air that had surrounded him the previous evening had given way to a more present, engaged attitude. He spoke directly to Arlo, explaining what they might see at the gardens, occasionally glancing at Ilara for confirmation that his approach was appropriate. "There's a section called the fernery," he told Arlo. "It's like a hidden world of green, cool and quiet with water features. I thought you might enjoy the sensory experience." Ilara nodded encouragingly. Elliot was learning to speak to his son in terms of experiences rather than abstract concepts, a significant shift in his approach. The afternoon at the Royal Botanic Gardens proved to be a turning point. Arlo, typically reserved in new environments, displayed unprecedented engagement with his surroundings. He moved from exhibit to exhibit with purpose, studying plants, watching birds, following patterns of light through the canopy. Elliot stayed close, occasionally offering information, but mostly just accompanying his son on this journey of discovery. In the fernery, as predicted, Arlo was captivated. The cool, misty environment with its layered textures and filtered light created a multisensory experience that seemed perfectly calibrated to his preferences. He spent nearly an hour there, examining individual fronds, listening to the gentle drip of water, watching patterns of shadow and light. Ilara hung back, allowing father and son this shared experience. She observed as Elliot gradually relaxed into the moment, his usual corporate posture giving way to a more natural stance as he crouched beside Arlo, pointing out details at the boy's eye level. When they finally emerged from the gardens late in the afternoon, all 3 were pleasantly tired. Arlo fell asleep in the car on the way back to the house, his head nodding against the seat. "Today was good," Elliot said, quietly watching his sleeping son. "Better than I dared hope," Ilara nodded. He was genuinely engaged, not just tolerating the outing, but experiencing it fully. "Because of your preparation," Elliot acknowledged. "The way you've taught me to approach him, to understand his perspective." "You were already learning," Ilara said gently. "You just needed permission to trust your instincts as his." "Father," Elliot's gaze remained on Arlo. "I've made a decision," he said after a moment, "about our living arrangements." Ilara waited, sensing the significance of what was coming. "We'll maintain the Hunter Valley estate as our primary residence," Elliot continued. "I've spoken with the board this morning. I'll be stepping back from daily operations temporarily, working remotely except for essential meetings. Nathan Phillips, my CFO, will handle the Sydney office and investor relations while I focus on the strategic direction from the valley." It was a dramatic shift from the path he'd been on just 24 hours earlier, a redirection of priorities that would have significant professional implications. "That's a major change," Ilara observed carefully. "Yes," Elliot agreed, "but a necessary one. You were right. What Arlo needs most right now is stability and connection. I can provide those better from the valley than from behind a desk in Sydney, regardless of physical proximity." "And the Blackwoods?" Ilara asked. "They won't be pleased," Elliot admitted, "but I'm prepared to offer generous visitation. They can come to the valley, or Arlo can visit them in Sydney with proper support. What I won't do is disrupt the progress he's making by changing his primary environment during this critical period of development." As the car pulled into the driveway of the Sydney house, Arlo stirred, blinking sleepily at the familiar surroundings. He looked between his father and Ilara, then out at the harbour view beyond. "Home soon," Elliot assured him gently. "Back to the valley, but first we have one more day here, and tomorrow you'll meet your grandparents." Arlo's expression remained neutral, but he reached out and touched his father's sleeve, a brief, deliberate contact that spoke volumes in its simplicity. In that moment, Ilara saw what Diana must have seen in Elliot Carver, not just the successful businessman, but a father capable of profound love and difficult choices, a man willing to reshape his world around his son's needs. As they entered the house, the setting sun cast long shadows across the polished floors, turning the austere interior briefly golden. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the Blackwoods, the announcement of Elliot's decision, the inevitable complications of families and expectations. But for now, in this moment of connection, Ilara sensed that something important had shifted, not just for Arlo, but for all of them. Invisible threads, once strained and fragile, were beginning to strengthen. Sunday morning arrived with a quiet tension that permeated the Sydney house. Ilara helped Arlo dress in the outfit Elliot had selected: khaki trousers and a light blue button-down shirt that brought out the color of his eyes. The clothing was more formal than Arlo typically wore at the estate, and he fidgeted with the collar repeatedly. "I know it's not very comfortable," Ilara said sympathetically as she gently adjusted the shirt. "But it's just for a few hours, for the brunch with your grandparents." Arlo didn't respond verbally, but his expression conveyed resignation. He allowed Ilara to comb his hair, then pointed to his tablet on the bedside table. "You can bring it," Ilara assured him. "Your dad said it's fine to have it with you if you need a break from the conversation." Downstairs, Elliot was reviewing documents in the living room, dressed impeccably in casual weekend attire that nonetheless projected authority. He looked up as Ilara and Arlo entered, his expression softening at the sight of his son. "You look very handsome, Arlo," he said, setting aside his papers. "Are you ready for our outing?" Arlo didn't answer but moved to the window, his usual spot when processing new information or preparing for transitions. Elliot caught Ilara's eye, his expression questioning. "He's a bit uncomfortable in the formal clothes," Ilara explained quietly, "but otherwise he seems prepared. I've brought the bubble solution in my bag just in case he needs a calming activity." Elliot nodded gratefully. "The Blackwoods can be intense. Margaret especially tends to expect traditional behaviors from children. I've asked them to be mindful of Arlo's needs, but we'll manage," Ilara assured him, "one step at a time." The Harrington residence in Point Piper was a colonial-style mansion, with manicured gardens sloping down to a private dock. As their car pulled through the gates, Ilara felt a flutter of anxiety. This world of Sydney's elite was far removed from her experience, and she was entering not as staff, but as Arlo's support person, a role that blurred traditional social boundaries. "The Harringtons are old friends," Elliot explained as they approached the house. "Richard was my mentor when I started in the industry. They've known Arlo since he was born." A uniformed butler greeted them at the door, leading them through a grand foyer to a sunroom overlooking the harbour. 4 people rose as they entered. An elegant older couple Ilara assumed were the Harringtons, and a distinguished pair who could only be the Blackwoods. "Elliot, darling," the older woman said, warmly, embracing him before turning her attention to Arlo. "And Arlo, my goodness, how you've grown." Arlo remained close to Ilara's side, his body language tense but controlled. He didn't make eye contact with anyone, focusing instead on a large aquarium built into one wall of the sunroom. "And this must be Ms. Mitchell," said the man Ilara now identified as Richard Harrington, extending his hand. "We've heard wonderful things about your work with Arlo." "Thank you," Ilara replied simply, shaking his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Margaret Blackwood stepped forward then, her appraising gaze moving from Ilara to Arlo. She was a handsome woman in her 70s, immaculately groomed with Diana's eyes and a considerably less warm expression. "Arlo, come give grandmother a hug," she said, her tone gentle but expectant. Elliot intervened smoothly. "Arlo is still adjusting to the new environment, Margaret. Perhaps give him a moment to settle in." A flicker of disapproval crossed Margaret's face, but she nodded stiffly. "Of course." James Blackwood, tall and distinguished with silver hair, approached more cautiously. "Hello, Arlo," he said, crouching slightly to the boy's eye level. "It's good to see you again." To everyone's surprise, Arlo turned to look directly at his grandfather for a brief moment. He didn't speak or move closer, but the acknowledgement was significant. "He remembers you, James," Elliot said quietly. The tension in the room eased slightly as Mrs. Harrington suggested they move to the terrace for brunch. The adults settled around an elegantly set table while Arlo, after a gentle prompt from Ilara, took a seat between her and his father. The conversation initially remained pleasant, focused on neutral topics: the beautiful weather, recent events in Sydney, mutual acquaintances. Ilara noticed that both Harringtons made conscious efforts to include Arlo in the interaction, addressing simple questions to him without expecting verbal responses. Noting his preferences as Elliot helped him select food from the buffet. The Blackwoods were more reserved, watching Arlo with a mixture of concern and assessment. Margaret in particular seemed to be cataloguing every behavior, every non-verbal cue, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "He's noticeably thin," she said during a lull in the conversation, addressing Elliot directly. "Is he eating properly at that estate of yours?" "Arlo has specific food preferences," Elliot replied evenly. "His diet is carefully monitored by a nutritionist who specializes in sensory sensitivities." "Sensory sensitivities," Margaret repeated, her tone suggesting skepticism. "In our day, children simply ate what was put before them." James Blackwood placed a restraining hand on his wife's arm. "Margaret?" "Well, it's true," she insisted. "All these modern labels and special accommodations, Diana never had such issues." Ilara felt Arlo tense beside her. He had stopped eating, his focus now on a small sailboat visible in the harbour below. His fingers began tapping a rhythm on the tablecloth, a self-regulating behaviour she recognized from moments of stress. "Actually," Ilara said quietly, "recent research indicates that many sensory processing differences have genetic components. They've always existed. We're just better at recognizing and supporting them now." All eyes turned to her, and Ilara immediately regretted speaking. It wasn't her place to challenge Margaret Blackwood, regardless of how misguided the woman's comments might be. "And you have expertise in this area, Ms. Mitchell?" Margaret asked coolly. "I've been working closely with Dr. Patel," Ilara replied, maintaining a respectful tone. "She's provided extensive information about current research and best practices." "Ilara has been instrumental in Arlo's progress," Elliot added firmly. "Her approach has opened communication channels that professional therapists couldn't establish." Margaret's expression remained skeptical. "Through bubbles, I understand. Hardly a conventional therapeutic technique, but an effective one," Richard Harrington interjected, his tone gently admonishing. "Results matter more than methods, Margaret. And from what Elliot has shared, the results have been remarkable." The conversation might have deteriorated further, if not for Arlo himself. As the tension at the table escalated, he reached deliberately into Ilara's bag, which sat beside her chair, and withdrew the bubble solution. With methodical movements, he unscrewed the cap, removed the wand, and placed it on the table in front of his grandmother. The adults fell silent, watching as Arlo held up 3 fingers toward Margaret. "I believe he's asking you to blow 3 bubbles," Ilara explained softly. Margaret appeared momentarily flustered. "Here? At the table?" "It's his way of connecting," Elliot said. of inviting you into his world. Something shifted in Margaret's expression, a crack in the facade of disapproval. She glanced at her husband, who nodded encouragingly. With surprising grace, Margaret picked up the wand and dipped it in the solution. 3 bubbles, she confirmed, looking at Arlo. She blew gently, creating 3 perfect spheres that drifted across the table, catching the sunlight. Arlo watched them intently, his body relaxing visibly as they floated away. When the last bubble popped, he held up 5 fingers toward his grandfather. James accepted the wand from his wife and created 5 bubbles as requested, his expression softening as he observed Arlo's focused engagement. "Diana used to do this with him," James said quietly. "On our back porch in Mosman. Summer evenings, just the 2 of them." A poignant silence fell over the table. For a moment, Diana's absence, the void around which they all orbited, became palpably present. "He remembers," Margaret said, her voice suddenly thick with emotion. "He associates the bubbles with her." "Yes," Elliot agreed. "Gently. I believe he does, and with connection, with safety." The moment marked a turning point in the brunch. Margaret's rigid posture gradually relaxed, and she began speaking of Diana, not with the usual undercurrent of accusation toward Elliot, but with genuine remembrance, sharing stories of her daughter's childhood that paralleled Arlo's behaviors in surprising ways. She organized her toys. "By color, not type," Margaret recalled. "We thought it was just a quirk. She'd line them up in rainbow order, and heaven help anyone who disrupted the pattern." "Arlo does the same with his books," Elliot noted. "By color, then size within each color group." "She struggled with certain food textures too," James added thoughtfully. "Particularly anything mushy. We just thought she was being fussy." "Perhaps," Richard Harrington suggested carefully, "Arlo has inherited more than just Diana's eyes." The implication hung in the air that Diana herself might have had sensory differences unrecognized in an era when such variations were less understood. For the Blackwoods, this perspective seemed to reframe their understanding of both their daughter and grandson. As the meal concluded, Elliot guided the conversation toward the topic they had all been avoiding, the future arrangements for Arlo's care. "I've been giving considerable thought to what's best for Arlo," he began, his tone measured but firm. "After consulting with his care team and observing his progress at the Hunter Valley estate, I've decided that should remain his primary residence for now." Margaret's expression tightened immediately. "Elliot, be reasonable. Your company is in crisis. You can't possibly provide the stability Arlo needs while managing that situation. That's precisely why I've restructured my professional responsibilities," Elliot replied calmly. "I'll be operating primarily from the Valley, with Phillips handling the Sydney office." "You're stepping back from Carver Energy?" James asked, clearly surprised. "That seems extreme." "Not stepping back, adjusting my role to prioritize Arlo's needs during this critical developmental period." Elliot's gaze was steady. "The company will manage. My son needs me now." "And what of our relationship with our grandson?" Margaret pressed. "Hidden away in the Valley, we'll hardly see him." "That's not my intention," Elliot assured her. "I'm proposing regular visits. You're welcome at the estate anytime, and when Arlo is comfortable with travel, he can spend weekends with you in Mosman, with appropriate support, of course." Margaret began to object, but James placed his hand over hers. "It's a reasonable arrangement, Margaret," he said quietly, "and clearly considered with Arlo's best interests in mind. You can't possibly agree with this isolation, James," Margaret protested. "It's not isolation," James corrected gently. "It's stability. And look at him." He gestured toward Arlo, who was calmly examining a decorative glass paperweight from the side table, turning it to catch the light. "He's more engaged, more present than we've seen him since Diana's death. Whatever they're doing at the estate is working." Margaret fell. Silent, her expression a complex mixture of resignation and concern. After a moment she turned to Ilara. "And you, Miss Mitchell? Will you continue in your current role?" The question caught Ilara off guard. She glanced at Elliot, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'll continue working with Arlo at the estate." It was the first time she had stated her decision definitively, though in truth it had been made the moment she watched Arlo and Elliot connect over bubbles in the Sydney living room. Some journeys, once begun, simply had to be completed. The rest of the visit passed without further confrontation. As they prepared to leave, Margaret took Ilara aside while the others were gathering their things. "I'm not entirely convinced by all this," she said frankly, "but I can see Arlo trusts you. That counts for something." "He's an extraordinary child," Ilara replied sincerely, "with a unique way of experiencing the world. I'm just trying to meet him where he is." Margaret studied her with penetrating eyes so like Diana's. "You care for him, not just professionally." "Yes," Ilara admitted. "I do." "Good," Margaret said simply, "because that's what he needs most. People who truly see him, not just what they wish he would be." She glanced toward Elliot, who was helping Arlo into his jacket. Perhaps his father is finally learning that lesson too. As they drove back to the Vaucluse house to collect their belongings for the return to Hunter Valley, Ilara reflected on the complex dynamics she had witnessed. The high Blackwoods were difficult, but not uncaring. Their concern for Arlo was genuine, even if their understanding of his needs was outdated, and Elliot had surprised her with his unwavering commitment to the path they had discussed, standing firm against both professional pressures and family expectations. "That went better than expected," Elliot remarked as they turned onto the coastal road. "Thank you for your support." "Arlo did the hard work," Ilara replied, glancing at the boy who was now dozing against the car window. That moment with the bubbles, offering them to his grandparents, that was entirely his initiative. "Inspired by you," Elliot said quietly, "by the connection you taught him to make." The remainder of the drive passed in comfortable silence. By the time they reached the Hunter Valley estate that evening, stars were appearing in the clear country sky, so different from the light-polluted Sydney night. As they pulled through the gates, Ilara felt a surprising sense of homecoming, not just to the familiar surroundings, but to a purpose that had become unexpectedly central to her life. Arlo, fully awake now, pressed his face to the window as the estate came into view, the main house illuminated against the darkening landscape. For the first time that weekend, he smiled, a small but unmistakable expression of recognition and relief. "Welcome home, Arlo," Elliot said softly. The boy turned to his father, then to Ilara, his gaze connecting briefly with each of them before returning to the view outside. No words were spoken, but in that moment of shared understanding, none were needed. Some languages require no translation. 3 months after the Sydney visit, the Hunter Valley estate had transformed. Not in its physical structure, the sandstone walls and surrounding vineyards remained unchanged, but in its atmosphere, its purpose, its very soul. What had once been a refuge had become a home. What had been silence had given way to a different kind of communication, not always verbal but authentic and alive. On a brilliant spring morning, Ilara stood on the terrace overlooking the garden, watching as Elliot and Arlo examined a newly installed weather station. Elliot was explaining how the anemometer measured wind speed, adjusting his language to focus on the sensory experience rather than abstract concepts. Arlo listened attentively, occasionally reaching out to touch the spinning cups. "He's really focused today," Maria observed, joining Ilara at the railing. The sensory garden was a brilliant addition. The area beneath the gum tree had indeed been transformed. Working with Dr. Patel and a landscape designer who specialized in therapeutic environments, Elliot had created a space specifically designed around Arlo's sensory preferences. Wind chimes produced gentle tones in the breeze. A small water feature created both visual interest and soothing sounds. Plants with interesting textures and aromas were arranged in geometric patterns that pleased Arlo's mathematical mind. "It's given him a safe space to explore sensory experiences on his own terms," Ilara agreed. "Dr. Patel says that's crucial for self-regulation." The changes extended beyond the garden. Inside the house, one wing had been converted into a specialized learning environment where Arlo worked with tutors who understood his unique cognitive style. Elliot had renovated his study to include a comfortable play area where Arlo could be present while he conducted business remotely, maintaining connection even during work hours. Most significantly, Elliot himself had changed. He had indeed restructured his role at Carver Energy, delegating daily operations to trusted executives while focusing on strategic direction. 3 days a week, he worked entirely from home. The other 2, he commuted to Sydney, returning each evening. Weekends were dedicated exclusively to Arlo with no business interruptions. The company had weathered its financial challenges better than expected. As Elliot explained to Ilara one evening, "Stepping back gave me perspective. I could see solutions that weren't visible when I was buried in daily crises. For Ilara, the past months had brought professional evolution as well. Her role had been formalized with proper compensation and title, children's specialist rather than housekeeper. She had moved from her cottage in Cessnock to a comfortable apartment in the estate's guest wing, close enough to be available for Arlo, but with space for her own life. Dr. Patel had arranged for her to receive proper training in supporting neurodivergent children, validating techniques she had intuitively developed and adding new tools to her repertoire. The bubble sessions continued, but had evolved into more complex interactions, incorporating music, light, and patterns in ways that expanded Arlo's communication abilities. The Blackwoods had become regular visitors, their initial resistance softening as they witnessed Arlo's progress. Margaret still occasionally made pointed comments about conventional education, but she had begun educating herself about autism spectrum disorders, even joining an online support group for grandparents of neurodivergent children. Judith, the estate manager, remained professionally distant, but had gradually accepted Ilara's elevated role. The rest of the staff had adjusted to the household's new purpose, many finding unexpected fulfillment in contributing to Arlo's supportive environment. On this particular morning, Ilara was awaiting an important visitor, Dr. Amelia Chen, a renowned specialist in neurodivergent communication, had traveled from Melbourne to observe Arlo and consult on the next phase of his development. She had particular expertise in helping non-verbal children find their voices, whether through traditional speech or alternative communication methods. "Miss Mitchell," Judith called from the doorway. "Dr. Chen has arrived." Ilara thanked her and went to greet the visitor, a petite woman with a warm smile and intelligent eyes. After introductions, Dr. Chen asked to observe Arlo in his natural environment before any formal assessment. "I prefer to see how he communicates when he's comfortable," she explained. "Formal testing environments can mask capabilities rather than reveal them." They moved to a viewing area near the sensory garden, where they could watch Arlo and Elliot without intruding. Dr. Chen took notes as Arlo engaged with various elements of the garden, paying particular attention to his nonverbal cues and interaction patterns. "He's quite expressive," she remarked. "The finger counting, the body positioning, the eye movement patterns, these are all deliberate communications." "Yes," Ilara agreed. "We've been documenting them, creating a sort of translation guide for new people in his life." Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. "Excellent approach. Many families try to force conventional communication rather than honoring and expanding the child's natural language." They continued observing as Elliot and Arlo moved to a flat grassy area where a collection of bubble wands had been set out, not just the small ones they had started with, but larger wands for creating giant bubbles, multi-hole wands for bubble clouds, and even a bubble machine for continuous production. "The bubbles were our first breakthrough," Ilara explained. "They're still central to our interaction with him." Dr. Chen watched as Elliot dipped a large wand into a solution tray and swept it through the air, creating a massive, wobbling sphere that captured the morning sunlight in rainbow swirls. Arlo followed its journey with rapt attention, his body language entirely focused. "Fascinating," Dr. Chen murmured. "The perfect intersection of visual, mathematical, and physical properties. I can see why they resonate with him." As the giant bubble drifted toward the gum tree, catching in its branches before bursting, something unexpected happened. Arlo turned to his father and pointed upward. "Sky," he said clearly. Elliot froze, the bubble wand suspended in mid-motion. His eyes widened as he stared at his son. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Arlo pointed again, more emphatically this time. "Sky," he repeated, the word distinct and deliberate. Ilara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Beside her, Dr. Chen straightened, her professional demeanor momentarily forgotten. "He spoke," Ilara whispered. "He actually spoke." Elliot knelt slowly to Arlo's level, his movements careful, as if afraid any sudden gesture might break the spell. "Yes, Arlo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sky." The bubble went up to the sky. Arlo nodded, that familiar, communicative gesture, and held up. Both hands, fingers spread wide. 10, he said, his third word in over a year. Tears welled in Elliot's eyes. 10 bubbles? You want 10 more? Arlo nodded again, his expression serious but engaged. With hands that trembled slightly, Elliot prepared the wand and created 10 more giant bubbles, counting them aloud as they formed. Arlo watched each one, his lips moving silently as he counted along. When the 10th bubble had drifted away, Arlo turned to look directly at the observation area where Ilara and Dr. Chen stood. His gaze found Ilara unerringly, as if he had known all along exactly where she was. "Ilara," he said, his voice small but clear. "Come." The sound of her name in his voice sent a shockwave through Ilara's system. Without conscious thought, she moved toward him, dimly aware of Dr. Chen following at a respectful distance. "I'm here, Arlo," she said as she reached him, kneeling beside Elliot. Arlo looked between them, his expression solemn but somehow lighter than it had ever been, as if some internal barrier had finally given way. "Bubbles," he said simply, pointing to the wand in Elliot's hand, then to Ilara. Understanding immediately, Ilara took the wand. "How many would you like?" she asked, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Arlo considered for a moment, then said decisively, "Many." And so, in the dappled shade of the gum tree, with the Hunter Valley stretched around them in golden autumn splendor, Ilara created a stream of bubbles that filled the air with rainbow-hued spheres. Beside her, Elliot watched his son's face, transform with a joy that had been too long absent. Dr. Chen remained at a distance, her expression one of professional satisfaction, combined with genuine wonder. "This is why I do this work," she said quietly. "For moments like this." Later, after Arlo had continued to speak in single words throughout the morning, blue, water, book, dad, Dr. Chen sat with Ilara and Elliot in the library to discuss what had occurred. "This breakthrough didn't happen by accident," she explained. "It's the result of months of building trust, creating a supportive environment, and honoring Arlo's natural communication style. You laid the groundwork for speech by respecting his non-verbal language first." "Will he continue to speak?" Elliot asked, the question that weighed most heavily on his mind. "Speech development isn't linear, especially in cases like Arlo's," Dr. Chen cautioned. "There will likely be fluctuations, days of verbal expression followed by periods of silence. The key is to continue supporting all his communication methods, verbal and non-verbal alike." "So the bubbles, the counting, the patterns, we continue with all of it?" Ilara clarified. "Absolutely," Dr. Chen confirmed. "Those are his foundations. His words will build upon them, not replace them." As they discussed strategies for supporting Arlo's emerging speech, Ilara found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. From her first impulsive bubble blowing in the garden to this moment of breakthrough, the path had been neither straight nor predictable. There had been setbacks, uncertainties, moments of doubt, but throughout there had been one constant, the unwavering commitment to meeting Arlo where he was, not where convention said he should be. That evening, after Dr. Chen had departed with plans to return for follow-up visits, Ilara joined Elliot on the terrace. Arlo was already in bed, the excitement of the day having exhausted him. His last word before falling. Asleep had been tomorrow, a concept that implied continuity, expectation, hope. "I still can't believe it," Elliot said softly, staring out at the vineyard where lights twinkled in the distance. "After all this time, all the specialists, all the therapies, and it was Bubbles, it was you." "It was Arlo," Ilara corrected gently. "He found his way in his own time. We just created the space for it to happen." Elliot turned to face her, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "When Diana died, I thought our lives were over. Not just because she was gone, but because Arlo retreated so completely. It was like losing them both at once." Ilara nodded, understanding the depth of that double grief. "I did everything I thought was right," Elliot continued. "The best doctors, the most exclusive therapists, the perfect environment, but none of it reached him. Not until you came along with your simple solution and your profound respect for who he actually is. Sometimes the simplest connections are the most meaningful," Ilara observed. "Bubbles are just air and soap, nothing special, but they create a moment of beauty, a shared experience. That's what Arlo needed. Not more therapy, but more connection." Elliot was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. "You've changed us," he said finally. "Both of us. Me, perhaps, even more than Arlo." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. In the months of working together, their relationship had evolved from employer-employee to something more complex. a partnership founded on mutual respect and shared purpose. They had maintained professional boundaries, focused entirely on Arlo's needs, but Ilara couldn't deny the subtle shift in their interactions, the growing ease and understanding that extended beyond their work with his son. "I should thank you," Ilara said after a moment, "for trusting me, for giving me the opportunity to find my own path. I was just a housekeeper when I came here. Now," she smiled softly, "now I know what I'm meant to do." "You were never just anything," Elliot replied. "You saw possibilities where others saw only limitations. You found connection where others found only silence." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I'd like you to consider a more permanent arrangement, not just as Arlo's specialist, but as part of our family's future, whatever form that might take." The implication was clear, though delicately phrased. Not a declaration, but an opening, a bubble of possibility set adrift between them. "That's a conversation for another day," Ilara said gently. "Today belongs to Arlo and his voice." Elliot nodded, accepting the wisdom in her response. "Of course." They stood in comfortable silence, watching as the last light faded from the sky. In the garden below, the sensory elements created subtle music in the evening breeze. Wind chimes chiming softly, water burbling over smooth stones, leaves rustling in the gum tree that had witnessed the beginning of their journey. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, new words perhaps. Arlo's path forward would not be without obstacles. There would be difficult days alongside the triumphant ones. The Blackwoods would continue to have expectations. The company would make demands. The world would present complications. But in this moment, in the quiet of a Hunter Valley evening, what mattered was the simple truth that had emerged from beneath the weight of silence. Connection was possible, in its own time and in its own way. A bubble floating through. Sunlight. A word spoken after a year of silence. A hand reaching out, finding another waiting to receive it. "Sky," Ilara murmured, echoing Arlo's first word. "Of all the words he could have chosen." "It's perfect, isn't it?" Elliot smiled. "Boundless, full of light, always there even when hidden by clouds. Like hope," Ilara thought. Like love. Like the countless possibilities that lay ahead for a boy who had found his voice and the people who had learned to listen. Above them, stars appeared one by one in the deepening blue, pinpoints of light in the vastness, separate yet connected in ancient patterns. Silent but eloquent, distant but essential, much like the language of bubbles that had brought them all together.